Okay, the lecture today is on memory, and so I'll give you an overview of this chapter. This is one of our longer chapters, so remember, if you want to take a break, you can always click on the stop on the video, the same that you would on any video, so you can stop and start as you like. We'll first cover some models of memory, including the information processing view, stage or three-box theory, levels of processing theory, and parallel distributed processing theories. So 4 different major theories that we'll cover. Then we'll go to the biological basis of memory, and we'll briefly talk about short-term memory. In other words, when you're just trying to remember information for about 15 to 25 seconds, are there any changes that happen biologically? And then we'll talk about long-term memory, which at least in theory lasts your entire lifetime, and we'll look at biological changes associated with that. Then we'll look at a particular case study of the hippocampus to help us understand how important that is in memory. We'll finish by talking about Alzheimer's and how to interact with Alzheimer's patients. So to begin, our first model is the information processing model, and it basically just looks at these very, very broad phases in information processing that you have to go through in order to remember information. Encoding just means you retranslate the information so that you can, quote unquote, get it into the brain. In other words, you have to be able to understand the information enough so that you can kind of rehearse it, think about it, and relate it to information that's in memory, which is where storage comes in. Once you've related it to information in memory or created a framework for that and rehearsed or learned it, you should be able to retain it. And that storage is tested at retrieval, where you try to get the information back out. And to be frank, this is really just a very broad overview, so I don't think of it as a model as much as I do the other 3 models that we'll talk about. The second way to look at memory is called stage or 3-box theory. And it's called 3-box because it presumes that information goes through 3 filters before you actually remember it long term. And so it's a very kind of sequential, orderly theory of memory. This is one of the older theories of memory, and although it's not the one that's most popular today, people do use each of the stages separately to understand memory. So again, information passes through these 3 phases, and the first phase is called sensory memory. The first type of sensory memory is iconic or visual memory. An icon is a visual image, and so the word iconic makes sense. Just as an example of this, if you hold an object in front of you against a blank wall and you just stare just at that object and shut your eyes just for a second behind your eyelids, as odd as that sounds, you see kind of a crude image of what you just looked at. And of course, it's the short term, which makes sense because you wouldn't want to have overlapping visual images as you move your eyes around. Auditory is the same except for what you hear. And so again, both of these last less than a second. Lots of information loss in that first phase, and according to 3-box or 3-stage theory, if it makes it out of sensory, it moves into short-term memory, which lasts somewhere around 15 to 25 seconds, and it's referred to as working memory, which is a great name for it because this is where you're working with information. Let's say that you're studying for an exam. You may be rehearsing it, you may be retranslating it, and again, that 15-25 seconds, and it does have a limited capacity, and the capacity is pretty fixed. You can typically remember 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of new information. Even some recent research suggests that may be overly optimistic for complex information. And hopefully what that tells you is anytime you're trying to tell anybody anything, including directions, if it has more than about 5 steps in it, you need to write it down for the person or allow them to write it down. They're not going to remember it. Similarly, if you're training someone on a task and it has more than a few steps, you need to give them a memory aid because just because you remember it doesn't mean they're going to remember it. So is this link flexible? We do know that you can flex it through something called chunking, and chunking is just combining information into units. So for instance, you might take the first letter of every word that you have to remember and make that letter into a word. So if you do this, then you only have to remember the one word rather than the individual pieces. Memory limits do lead to predictable effects within short-term memory, so we're still talking about short-term here. One is called the serial position effect. If I read a list of items to you, I can promise you that you're going to remember information at the beginning and the end of that list much better than the information at the end. And the diagram below shows this. At the very top of the diagram is a really short list, and what you'll see on the y-axis, there's accuracy, which ranges from 0 to perfect. And then on the x-axis is the length of the list. So let's focus on that short list, and you'll see accuracy is very high at the beginning and end, drops at the middle. For the moderate list, which is the one below it, you'll see the same effect. And for the long list, you see it even more pronounced, where that accuracy is even worse for information at the middle. And so this basically tells you items at the beginning and end of a segment will be remembered the best. The von Restorff effect is different, and that tells you that distinctive or unusual items will be remembered. As an example of that, let's just say that you meet somebody whose name is Cedric in the middle of a party. You're likely to remember their name. And finally, in short-term memory, there's déjà vu. This is reconstructive memory, which means you're kind of filling in the gaps of memory. Memories are stored in associated chunks, and you can kind of be in a situation where your memory is fooled. For instance, most of us have met someone for the first time, and intellectually you know it's for the first time, but you get this weird feeling you've met them before. Well, probably what's going on is that they have characteristics in their face or something about their voice that is familiar to you. It was present in another person that you've already met. And so what you get is you recognize this one particular feature, and it triggers a false memory of having met that individual. But there's a good cognitively based explanation for that. Long-term memory is the final box, and at least in theory it lasts forever. Long-term memory is actually stored in different places in the brain, which is an advantage since you may lose some kinds of memory and not others if you have brain injury. Procedural memory is memory of how. And anything from how to play golf, like this guy's doing, how to add fractions, anything that involves a process is procedural memory. Declarative memory is factual. For instance, remembering the major cities here in the upstate of South Carolina would be semantic or factual memory. And finally, episodic is memory for personal experiences, like the memory of your first date that's unique to you. Now, the second level of processing theory, this third approach, is very different from the initial one we talked about. Level of processing theory doesn't just overview the stages. It looks at how we're processing information. In other words, it suggests that the more you work with information, the better memory is. So, for shallow information processing, if you're trying to remember the face of someone that you saw just briefly, like during a car accident, and all you can remember is that the person who caused the accident was a white male, that's shallow. Superficial characteristics and a few features, but that memory is not going to help police track down the perpetrator. On the other hand, intermediate is categories, and it's more detailed characteristics. So, for instance, if you can remember that they had dark hair, you can remember that they were balding, that's more detail that might help identification. And finally, the deepest level of memory is called deep, and it's unique characteristics related to past information, like being able to recognize that person in a lineup. And that turns out to actually be a very difficult task. So these three levels reflect different levels of working with information and also reflect different levels of ability to remember detail. So deeper processing means better memory and better comprehension. The final model is parallel distributed processing, and this is an unusual one because it's kind of microanalytic. In other words, it says you process a ton of information all at once and you're anticipating information as it's presented. For instance, as I say the word present, before I finish that word, you already are anticipating what I'm going to say based on past experience. So this model, more than any other, suggests that you're really active in information processing. So the level of analysis in this is a neuron. It does have a biological flavor, and learning is suggested to reinforce the strength of connections between these neurons. Let's talk about forgetting for a minute, and we'll talk about two different basic theories of forgetting. One is called interference theory, and interference theory just suggests that the information that you're trying to get is actually in memory, it's just being interfered with by either newer or older information. We've all had this experience. Just as an example, if you meet someone and you're like, oh, I know I've met them before, but I can't remember their name. I know their name. It's actually a name for that phenomenon called tip of the tongue phenomenon. That's consistent with interference theory. Now, here are two terms in interference theory that can be confusing, so I'll talk about those in a little bit of detail. The first kind of cue or the first trick in keeping these two types of interference separate from one another is to remember that the first part of your word tells you which information is being compromised. In other words, what kind of information is being interfered with. And if you can remember that retro means old, in retroactive interference, old information is interfered with by new information. So, for instance, let's say that I learned WordPerfect years and years ago, and then I learned Microsoft Word. Then a friend of mine gave me a document I wanted to read and modify, and it was in WordPerfect. Probably I'm going to use some of the commands from Microsoft Word inappropriately in WordPerfect. That's when old information or the old word processing program and my mastery of those commands, it's interfered with by new information. Proactive interference is when new information is interfered with by old information, and hopefully the word pro kind of is associated with new information to you. So in proactive interference, let's hope this never happens, but let's say you date one person for a long time, you break up, you date a second person. If you call your new girlfriend or boyfriend by your old boyfriend or girlfriend's name, that's classic proactive interference. That new name is interfered with by the old name. The second major theory is decay theory, and this is very different than interference. Decay theory even feels different if you think about how it talks about forgetting. In decay theory, the information is simply gone, and you don't have that kind of lingering feeling that the information's in there, you just can't retrieve it. It's actually gone. And that's consistent with the idea that certain memories will fade due to non-use in time. Now notice that these two theories are not mutually exclusive. In other words, you can use both theories to explain different kinds of forgetting. Decay theory would be consistent with the kind of forgetting you would get. Let's say if a high school friend asked you if you remember that time that you skipped school and you just really have no memory for that. Reconstructive memory is just a general phenomenon, and basically reconstruction comes from the fact that we've got all these memory limits that we've talked about, and in order to function and make sense of our environment, since we don't have perfect memory, we fall into some errors in memory. Now these are not conscious errors, so it's not like you're lying. They're just natural errors that occur when we try to remember things. Leveling is when you forget details. So you forget, if somebody's telling you a long-winded story, you'll forget some of the little details in the story. Sharpening is when you kind of unconsciously exaggerate information, or you may even add in details which were not in the original story. And every time I look at this leveling and sharpening, I think of gossip and how it gets simpler and more extreme as it's passed on. A lot of details that make it less dramatic are dropped or leveled, and the details that are more dramatic often get sharpened. And so gossip is an unfortunate example of reconstructive memory. Children's memories are particularly interesting to psychologists because anytime something happens to a child, we know you have to be very careful about asking them about it. You have to be careful in how you're evoking those memories. Susie and Brooke did some work on suggestibility, which just means openness to change in terms of memory. And they found that preschoolers' memories are incredibly open to change, particularly if someone that the child doesn't know, who's kind of an authority figure, is asking questions. And so that's why when you see tapes of little ones being interviewed by good forensic psychologists or well-trained police, they're doing it in a very relaxed setting, and they're not being direct or really formal with them. You can make even older children and adults misremember by asking what's called leading questions. And a leading question is when you suggest an outcome. For instance, if you were a witness to an accident and you're trying to kind of sort through which car was responsible, if I said, "Did you see the driver in the red car hit the blue car?" That's a leading question. There's an implication in there that the red car is at fault. So instead of asking the question that way, you should keep it very open and general and just ask the person, for instance, what they saw. Misremembering as a result of leading questions is one form of confabulation, which means you're misremembering but not on purpose. We often misremember when we blend old and new information in together, and the fake information can seem real. An example of this was a study by Loftus and Cohn, who implanted a fake memory of being lost in a mall in children. They asked their older brother or sister to convince the younger brother or sister that they were lost in a mall one time, even though they'd already verified that that never actually happened. And by the end of the experiment, the younger children were absolutely convinced it happened and were adding in details. When they were told by their older brother and sister that it never happened, they were actually often many times kind of resentful, and they would say, "Oh, they remembered it." So very easy to implant memory. Now, I wish you would guess, eyewitness memory, even in adults, is not reliable. The great hope was that if we identified people who were really confident in their eyewitness memory, they would be more accurate. And unfortunately, that's not the case. The reason why this is important, especially in forensic or criminal psychology, is that if you're very confident in your eyewitness memory, you'll appear more persuasive in court, even if you're no more reliable than somebody who's more conservative about whether their memory is right. It's very easy to manipulate memory. And just as an example, the guy in the middle of the slide at the bottom actually committed a crime, and the two men on either side of him were actually accused of the crime. If you take a look at that face and ask yourself, could I, if I just saw this person fairly quickly, could I really reliably differentiate him from the two men on either side of him? Most people cannot do this. Okay, let's talk about biology of memory. Now, if you want to take a break, this is a good point to just stop the video and come back to it. So please feel free to do that. If you're continuing with me, we'll go ahead and dive into biology of memory, and we'll talk about first short-term memory. Short-term memory, if you remember, is that working memory that lasts 15 to 25 seconds. And we know that when you are kind of working with information, there are no structural changes at the level of the neuron, but there is change in neurotransmitter release. And what you're looking at is neurotransmitters in the synapse between two neurons. The particular neurotransmitter involved is acetylcholine. And we've talked about that in Chapter 2, so you may recognize it. We know now that acetylcholine is extremely important in memory. For instance, in people suffering from Alzheimer's, there's disruption in acetylcholine transmission. Long-term memory is different. This is when we're actually storing information. And in long term, we know the neurons become more excitable, so it's easier for them to respond. And the dendrites actually grow and branch out and become more complex. And this continues for weeks to years. So it's an argument for staying active mentally. It actually causes structural changes at the level of the neuron. Now we're bumping up to a different level. The hippocampus, if you recall from Chapter 2, is a deep brain older structure, and the hippocampus is in the limbic system. It's extremely important in allowing us to store new memories, and I could talk about it all day, but there's nothing like kind of seeing what happens when there's hippocampal damage. So we're going to take a look at a case study, Clive Waring, and in Clive, the hippocampus is almost completely destroyed. Some of the left frontal lobe has been destroyed as well. The overly emotional behavior repeating himself is actually due to the frontal lobe damage, but that terrible memory loss that you'll see is a sign of hippocampal damage. Oddly enough, Clive used to be a classical music conductor, and all of those skills are intact because they were learned prior to his injury, which actually happened from viral encephalitis. So the old information is stored, but he cannot remember anything new, not even, let's say you were reading this slide to him. By the time you got to the word damage, of frontal lobe damage, he would have forgotten what you said at the beginning. So these overlearned skills prior to injury, though, are intact. And this is a link. You can copy and paste this in the audio version to your browser, and it's a short video. He's a very famous case study, so if you just type Clive Waring into YouTube, you'll see him at different points in his life and how he's adjusted somewhat to the memory loss. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do to help him repair the hippocampus, but in his later years, which are not shown in this short clip, he's not as distressed as he was when the injury was newer. Okay, I want to wrap it up by talking about Alzheimer's, which is, of course, progressive memory loss. And at the beginning of the disease, old information is not seriously impaired, and so you can actually play on this fact to the advantage of the person with Alzheimer's whenever you visit them. As the disease progresses, they will lose information. They'll forget even personal information, and often when asked about it, they'll kind of make information up that seems to be logical. People have different philosophies about this phenomenon called confabulation again. And when someone confabulates with Alzheimer's, I always choose to let them speak, and I never correct them, because if you correct them, it usually just makes them embarrassed and uncomfortable. So they're just covering up for memory loss. This memory loss, as you might guess, is tied to acetylcholine deficits. We're looking at a slide of tissue here, and what you see in the slide is all this pink healthy tissue. That's the healthy part. But there are arrows pointing to what looks like kind of black streaks. It almost looks like black pieces of yarn that are embedded in the tissue. And these black pieces of yarn, if you blew them up under a microscope, are actually necrotic or dead tissue. And at the level of the neuron, this black tissue looks like you took a nice healthy neuron and just twisted it into a cord. So these black areas in the brain of the Alzheimer's patient are areas where you cannot have normal transmission of information. So interacting with Alzheimer's patients, just to kind of paraphrase these, Any kind of information you can bring in from their early life or childhood, like music they used to listen to or photos, are comforting to them. Seasonal gifts are helpful. For instance, if it was the season around Halloween and you brought in Halloween decorations, that's something that's overlearned. And at least in the early parts of the disease, it can help the person orient themselves in terms of season. In terms of time, moon phase clocks that change from sun to moon as the day goes on can also be helpful, especially if that sun moon is really highly visible on the clock. And again, my philosophy, I don't correct them when they retell stories because it tends to embarrass them and they withdraw from conversation. You also should remember, if this is a family member or a dear friend, if they just woke up, they're going to be really disoriented. So if they're asleep when you visit, you may want to time your visit at another day when you walk in and they're already awake. Okay, that concludes our lecture on memory, and I hope you enjoyed hearing this information.